So let's talk about this article that I found today, which is something I knew about but would like to talk about. Researchers ready NASA's SphereX space telescope for 2025 launch. You might ask, Xoren, you talk about JWST and that thing launched pretty recently. Why do we need another telescope in space? My answer to you, first of all, is we can never have enough. A. And B, this is doing a very different thing. So, SphereX is what's called a survey. It is a telescope that was designed specifically to look at the entire sky, as much as we can see at least. Whereas JWST is looking for specific objects, and it's like, hey, let's point our telescope here, take a look at that particular object. Let's take a look at these particular objects over here. SphereX is going to make an entire map of the sky in actually a similar band to what JWST is looking at. This telescope is designed to look at the entirety of the sky, which has been done before. We've done this, WISE is the one that this is most commonly put up against. WISE was another mission, the Wide Field Infrared Survey Explorer. This was an older program that NASA did where they mapped the entire sky, but this thing's going to do it better. This telescope is really cool, so I wanted to talk about it. The actual news about it was that we finally got it in its test chamber, and we're going to start testing its instruments. It's been completely built, but now we're actually going to test it to make sure it's ready for launch. It was originally going to launch in 2024, but now it's looking like it's going to launch in 2025. So what does this thing do? What does it do different than what we've already got? Well, the cool thing about it, it has a really, really wide field of view. So it is smaller. It's a very small telescope. Like, if you look at this, that's the actual telescope itself right there. It's not really, it's actually a little shorter than a person on average. So you might wonder, well, how can something so small be so powerful? JWST is pretty big, right? This thing has a lot of tricks up its sleeve, and they're all very, very cool. Also, fun fact, this test chamber in here, which is designed to be a vacuum chamber and a dark chamber, and a cool chamber, all of those three things, it's basically meant to mimic space as best you can, because you can't just test this thing inside of like a brightly lit lab or even a dimly lit lab. It'll swamp the sensors. So in order to get this thing in, they actually had to go through a hole in the ceiling of the basement, which a lot of these types of institutions have. So they had to lower it down through this concrete slab, which is really neat. I love seeing these types of things. So let's take a look at the actual spacecraft. This is what SphereX would look like, or it is what it will look like once it's actually launched. And it's got some neat features, a few things you're probably already picking out and being like, why does it have that? So first things first, giant solar panel. This thing has some ability to change its position, which is necessary due to the way that the orbit is going to work. We need to stay away from pointing at the Earth and away from the sun, since it has such a huge field of view. That actually is a problem. But I think the most striking thing that you're probably going to ask is, why does it have cones? It looks like just one cone, but in just a second, it's got three of those things. So why does it have those cones? This is the actual telescope itself. I'll talk a little bit more about its components, but it's all housed inside of those three giant cones. And that's the actual space module itself that's going to do all the adjustments that it needs to make. I also found this excellent talk. It's almost an hour long, but it's a fantastic talk that describes all of the mission objectives. It describes all of the design choices. It describes how they're going to get the thing into space. It's very, very cool, very informative. I watched through most of it when I was prepping for this talk. So what is this thing going to do? This thing is looking at the far edges of the universe. This is trying to look at what's called the reionization stage of the universe. This is pretty soon after the Big Bang, when the first stars started forming and the first galaxies started to form, when their radiation began to reionize all of the surrounding molecular hydrogen. This goes into a little bit more of the specifics as to, how the thing is actually going to work. And fun fact, this right here, this blue and green section over here, this is the launch vehicle. This tiny little thing down here, that's the actual telescope. We're using a launch vehicle this large to launch a tiny little thing, which is understandable. Space launches are hard, and they even comment that they don't need something this big, but that's what they were given to launch the vehicle, so they take it. So let's take a look at the actual thing itself. Now, I mentioned this thing is small, and this thing gets compared to WISE all the time. The actual objective, the actual primary mirror of this thing, is smaller than WISE. In fact, it's twice as small when we talk about its actual diameter, which means that it's a quarter as small. The most important part of a telescope is not its ability to zoom, it's its ability to capture light. This is a problem because a smaller surface area means you capture less light. But the thing I don't talk about, because most telescopes are dealing with a relatively tight field of view, it's actually the area of the primary or the aperture multiplied by its field of view, which is what this omega is. It's actually called a solid angle. The important thing, though, is that while SphereX has a very small area, it's got a gigantic field of view, 65 times larger than WISE was. So even though we are dealing with, 4 times less mirror area, we're dealing with 65 times more field of view, which means overall we have 16 times more light gathering power, more or less. Even though it's small, it captures a lot of the sky. The way it works is really cool. We're going to be orbiting on the terminator. The terminator is the line that separates day and night on the Earth, and we're going into an orbit that's going to be going around that terminator. That's going to allow us to look at everything without seeing too much of the sun's light. And as we do that, we're going to be mapping the sky, going around, mapping the north and then the south, and the north and the south, and the north and the south, and going around and around and around until we map the entire sky. The way we do that is we have 2 different detectors. One detector that's measuring transmitted light and one that's measuring reflected light, and both of them give us different portions of the spectrum of the thing we're looking at. And the way it works is that as we slew through whatever object we're looking at, we gather data across one of those, and then we start to leave that and gather data from the second one. And when we take those 2 and we stitch them together, we get the full spectrum. So we're effectively looking at 2 things or multiple things at once. As we go away from this object, we start to get different information at different parts of the spectrum. It's really, really smart. This is a very, very good idea. It allows us to do a lot with a very small instrument. Again, highly recommend this talk if you want. It's on Jet Propulsion Labs. Here's the moment you've all been waiting for. What are those cones for? These are actually cooling devices. They're photon shields. So the way it works is multifaceted. It's to block light from coming in, and it's also a way to dissipate any heat that the device creates. This thing needs to be kept at, here we go, less than 55 Kelvin, which is very, very cold, by the way, like super duper cold. And the actual telescope itself needs to be relatively cold as well. It's still very, very cold. Yeah, we gotta keep this thing cold. And we do that with this cooling system. First of all, like I said, they're photon shields. Second of all, they also radiate a lot of stuff. But yeah, there's a lot more on this. I think I'm just gonna call it there because we've been talking about this for like 15 minutes now.